Okay, so I'm back home from summer camp, reunited with Marcus, Tyler, and Devin. And naturally, the first thing they want to hear about is every single detail of the flashlight mystery with Mila. But once I finish telling that whole story, Marcus gets this look on his face, the exact same look he had right before Camp Pinewood, and goes, "Okay, since you're on a mystery-solving streak apparently, we need to finally check out the old house on Maple Street." Now, every neighborhood has one of these houses, right? The one everyone whispers about, the one with some kind of vague, half-remembered ghost story attached to it nobody can actually explain properly if you ask them directly. Ours is this old, run-down house at the very end of Maple Street, with overgrown ivy covering most of the front, boarded-up windows, and a yard so wild and untamed it looks more like a tiny forest than an actual lawn. The story, as far as any of us actually know it, goes something like this. Supposedly, decades ago, an old woman named Mrs. Winslow lived there completely alone, and one day she just vanished without a trace, and nobody in the neighborhood ever really found out what happened to her. Some older kids claim you can still see lights flickering in the upstairs windows sometimes at night, though honestly, given my recent experience with old Pete and his lantern walks, I'm personally a little skeptical of any mysterious flickering light claims at this point. Devin, predictably, is not thrilled about this plan. Guys, we just got done with 2 mysteries already this summer. Do we really need a third one? But Tyler, still riding high on his sheltering victory confidence from earlier this summer, is already fully on board. Come on, Devin, what's the worst that could happen? Which, considering our track record of things going sideways almost immediately whenever someone says that exact phrase, honestly should have been our first warning sign. We decide to check it out on a Saturday afternoon, figuring daylight hours are significantly less creepy than attempting this at night, which feels like a reasonably smart safety precaution, at least by our usual standards of decision making this summer. We bike over to Maple Street, and standing there in front of the actual house in broad daylight, it's honestly even creepier looking than I remembered from just biking past it occasionally. The front gate is rusted nearly shut, requiring all 4 of us pushing together just to squeeze through a gap wide enough to fit through sideways. The yard is genuinely wild, with vines climbing up basically every surface, and this eerie quiet that feels different from the rest of the neighborhood, like sound itself just doesn't carry the same way once you're inside that rusty gate. Marcus naturally wants to head straight for the front door, but Tyler points out that the door looks like it's been boarded up pretty securely, probably by the city or whoever technically owns the property now. Instead, we notice a side window with a board that's come slightly loose, hanging by just one nail, creating just enough of a gap to potentially squeeze through if we're careful about it. Devon, still not thrilled about any of this, goes, "This feels like exactly the kind of thing that gets you in huge trouble." Fair point, breaking into an old abandoned house is genuinely not something any of our parents would approve of if they knew about it. But curiosity, as usual this summer, wins out over good judgment, and one by one, we squeeze through that loose window into the house. Inside, it's dim, dusty, and honestly kind of sad in a way I didn't expect. There's still old furniture covered in thick white sheets, giving everything this ghostly draped appearance that immediately makes Marcus start doing his best spooky ghost voice, which Devin quickly tells him to stop doing because it's not helping the situation at all. We start exploring carefully, and the whole downstairs is honestly just kind of an ordinary old house filled with dusty furniture, faded wallpaper, and this thick layer of dust covering literally every surface, undisturbed for what must be decades at this point. There's an old kitchen with cabinets still stocked with ancient-looking canned goods, a dusty dining room table, still set with plates like someone was expecting dinner guests that never actually arrived. Tyler finds an old staircase leading upstairs, and despite Devin's continued protests about pushing our luck, we decide to check it out, testing each step carefully since some of the wood looks pretty rotted and unstable in places. Upstairs, we find a few bedrooms, similarly frozen in time, but it's the last room at the end of the hallway that catches our attention. Because unlike every other room we've checked, this door is actually closed. We push it open carefully, and inside is what used to be a small study or office, with an old wooden desk covered in dust and mounted on the wall. Surprisingly still intact despite everything else in the house looking so worn down, is this large, detailed painting of a woman who we assume must be Mrs. Winslow herself, based on the old-fashioned style of her clothing in the portrait. While we're all staring at this portrait, genuinely a little spooked by the whole atmosphere at this point, Devin notices him tucked behind some old books on a nearby shelf, a small wooden box, similar in a way to the one we found back at Camp Pinewood, though this one looks significantly newer and better preserved. Inside the box, we find a collection of old letters tied together neatly with a faded ribbon, along with several photographs showing Mrs. Winslow at various points in her life. And most interestingly, what appears to be a real estate document dated from several years back. Marcus starts reading through the letters, and it turns out they're actual correspondence between Mrs. Winslow and her son, who apparently lived out of state. The final letter in the collection, dated much more recently than we expected, actually reveals the real, much less mysterious explanation behind everything. Mrs. Winslow didn't mysteriously vanish at all. She simply moved into an assisted living facility to be closer to her son as she got older, and the house, due to some complicated family and legal issues mentioned briefly in the letters, just ended up sitting empty and neglected for years while the family sorted out what to actually do with the property. No dramatic disappearance, no actual ghost story. Just an elderly woman who moved closer to family as she aged, leaving behind a house that time, and gradually turned into the spooky neighborhood legend we grew up hearing about, mostly through years of kids exaggerating and embellishing the story generation after generation until nobody actually remembered the real, much simpler explanation anymore. We're all standing there processing this genuinely kind of touching, if slightly anticlimactic discovery, when we suddenly hear a loud creak from downstairs, immediately sending all four of us into an instant panic. Tyler, in classic Tyler fashion, immediately assumes the worst, whisper shouting, "Someone's here!" Devin, looking like he wants to disappear entirely, goes, "I told you guys this was a bad idea." We carefully creep toward the top of the stairs, hearts pounding, fully expecting some kind of dramatic confrontation, only to find a very confused-looking neighborhood cat that apparently followed us in through the same loose window we used to get inside. The collective relief that washes over all four of us after that scare is honestly almost more exhausting than the fear itself was. We decide, given this scare and the fact that we've technically already solved the mystery, that it's probably time to head back outside before our luck with not getting caught runs out entirely. We carefully make our way back down, the cat trotting along curiously behind us, and squeeze back out through that same loose window, finally breathing properly again once we're back outside in the actual sunlight. That evening, feeling a little guilty about breaking into someone's actual property, even if it has been sitting abandoned for years, we decide to tell my mom the whole story, including the letters we found. She actually knows a little about the real estate situation in the neighborhood, and suggests we could probably safely mail those old letters to the address listed for Mrs. Winslow's son, since it seems like exactly the kind of thing a family would genuinely want back. Especially old photographs and letters like these. We spend the next few days carefully packaging everything up, writing a short note explaining how we found the box, and wanted to make sure it got back to the right people. A few weeks later, we actually get a letter back from Mrs. Winslow's son himself, thanking us for returning something that genuinely meant a lot to his family, and mentioning that his mother, now in her 90s but apparently still doing well, was honestly delighted to hear that kids in the old neighborhood still thought about her house, even after all these years. So yeah, that's the story of how our neighborhood's biggest, spookiest ghost legend turned out to be nothing more sinister than an elderly woman moving closer to her family, and how breaking into a technically abandoned house somehow led to genuinely reconnecting a family with pieces of their own history they thought were lost forever. Turns out, once again, that most of the scary local legends floating around are usually a whole lot less dramatic and a whole lot more human than anyone actually realizes. Next time, we're planning the ultimate surprise birthday party for Marcus, except things start going wrong almost immediately. And let's just say keeping a secret from your best friend turns out to be way harder than any of us expected. You are not going to want to miss what happens when this surprise almost completely falls apart. Subscribe so you catch it the moment it drops. And let me know in the comments if your neighborhood has its own spooky house legend. Because apparently every single neighborhood has at least one story just like ours. See you in the next one.